Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Today we are going to hear some information. Sorry, my phone was talking to me. To help support you all as we've been trying to create these virtual spaces to really cultivate a conversation that will support all of you in terms of what you're doing in your practice, how you might be able to do it in this type of environment, what type of support you need, both technical support, if we're able to respond to that, as well as sort of adaptive support, like how you emotionally can prepare yourself for doing what you need to do. How can you give your best self in this kind of environment? So we're trying to cultivate that space for communication, information, and connection. So that is what we're wanting to do today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathy to introduce herself. She's our executive director from the Kemp Center, and she can share a little bit more.
Thank you, Michelle. And I should make you do a little more introduction of yourself. How would that be?
Oh, my name is.
I want them to know who you are.
Okay. I am Michelle Howard, and I'm an associate director for product development. Basically, that means that me and my team are part of experiences that meet the needs of learners across the state of Colorado and beyond, in terms of not just knowledge, but sort of impact, emotional needs related to how you want to be best in practice and how we can best forward what everyone here is trying to do in the helping profession. So just a taste about me.
Thank you, Michelle. Well, I wanted everybody to understand we have a rich group of professionals at the center, and we're very fortunate to have a wide range of folks. So thank you for sharing a little bit about yourself. So I'm Kathy Wells. I'm the executive director of the Kemp Center. I've been in this role just over a year. I'm a child abuse pediatrician by training. I've been working with and connected to, affiliated with the Kemp Center for right about 20 years now. And it's truly a privilege and an honor to work with such a wide range of experts and professionals, both at the center, but also in terms of our relationships and our reach. And I think today's presentation is a good example of the kinds of professional connections, relationships, and reach that we hold very valuable at the center. And especially in times like this, that really I think we all need to reach into. And that is this time where we are faced with a pandemic, an experience that none of us is fully skilled and knowledgeable about how to manage. And so we're all in this sort of same boat of learning together. And one of the things that I've enjoyed most about my work as a child abuse pediatrician is the multidisciplinary nature of what I do. And that I get to work alongside other professionals, child welfare professionals, mental health, community organizations, child advocacy centers, legal experts, other folks that work in this collective field of child maltreatment together to best serve our most vulnerable children and families. And as we at the center really thought about what we're experiencing here, all of us, not just nationally, but internationally in this global pandemic, I thought, what an important example of how valuable it is to really draw upon expertise of each other. As we learn across systems, we learn and think about the work that we're doing. And so I want to do a couple things in setting the stage, and I did this, we had a couple sessions last week as well, but I want to first just acknowledge that this is a time where we don't have all the answers. In fact, sometimes it feels like we don't have many answers, and the information continually flows very rapidly, and it's continually changing. And it's really in those times that I think when we lean into one another and we learn what we can share with one another, I think that helps us all feel a little bit more comfortable with what we're experiencing, and a little bit more grounded. I also want to acknowledge it's a time where we have a tremendous amount of information coming at us. And I think these kind of forums are a great way to really sort of dive a little bit deeper into what we know and what we don't know. And for us, what we're really trying to do last week and this week is hear from you as to what you think is most important in terms of getting additional information and access to expertise. And so we call this a village because we really believe that we're in this together, that this is a village. It's going to take a village to support one another and get us through this, and how we share information with the different experts. And by the way, I would say experts, it doesn't matter what initials you have behind your name, what your role is, what your title is, whether you're frontline or whether you're in an administrative level, we're all learning from one another. And so the village that we've created is really at this point to share some information with you, dive a little bit underneath the surface in terms of what we know and what we don't know, create the space for you to share more about what you want to hear. And just in terms of letting you know what's happening next is after this week's sessions, we will take all the information you shared with us about what you wanted to know more about, and we're going to put all that together with our development team and develop some what we were going to be calling Kemp Cafes, which will be a little bit deeper dive with a hub of experts to really dig a little deeper in the areas you told us about. And just as a quick taste, you were all asked a question when you registered about what you needed to know or wanted to know more most about. And I just want to give you a taste of what we're hearing from all of you. So a lot of you want to understand how to use virtual spaces like this to do your work, to be more connected, to care for one another, but you also want to learn how to do that efficiently and effectively and safely, right? Because if we get Zoom bombed today, I'm be really bummed out because we have all the precautions at our university in terms of this Zoom space today. So we should not have those risks with us. But again, depending upon your resources, you may not have those things. A lot of folks are wanting to hear about mental health support, both in general, for the adults, for ourselves, for the adults that we're working with, and for the kids that we're working with, and what's the impact on the children that we're working with. We're hearing a lot of people want to hear a little bit more about how do we prevent abuse and neglect during these times. We're hearing lots of questions about child welfare practice, and this is a great segue into what you're going to hear Dr. Fallon talk about, and we're so excited to have her here today because a lot of you really want to know how to better do child welfare work, whether you're a child welfare practitioner, mental health, healthcare, ombudsman, other systems that work in the child welfare space, both in terms of how do we make sure that the folks in the front line are safe, and how are we assessing safety and risk during these challenging times when we can't have the same level of contact that we have traditionally been able to have. And then a lot of questions about out-of-home placement and how do we think about when kids aren't able to be in their homes for a variety of reasons, how do we make sure that they're safe? So just to give you a taste of what we've heard and what we are continuing to hear, and we'll be developing out further. But I don't want to stall anymore because I want you to hear from Dr. Barbara Fallon. So I'm going to turn it over to John Fluke, who's one of, and I look at the Brady Bunch wherever I see John up here. John is one of our fantastic, internationally well-respected researchers, and I'm going to let you introduce Dr. Barbara Fallon.
Hi, I'm John Fluke, as Kathy said, on the faculty with the Kemp Center. And it's really exciting and a privilege for me to be able to introduce Dr. Barbara Fallon, who's with the Factorial Montash faculty of social work at the University of Toronto. I've had a chance to work with Barb and with her team now for many years. And there are always very, very interesting and exciting things going on where she is. And I think she'd be delighted, or we should be delighted to hear about some of those kinds of things today. So Barb, can I turn it over to you?
Thank you so much, John. And thank you to Kathy for your kind invitation and to present to your Kemp writ large community. It's really a very good opportunity for me to hear about some of the innovation that's happening to in the country to our south. So I'm just going to get share my screen. Stop my video too. So can people see my screen?
Not yet. Did you?
Not yet.
Now can you?
Are you, Barbara, are you showing up as a host? Just want to make sure that that has been switched over to you, which will enable you to share your screen.
I think I can share it, but I turned my video off. Is that the problem?
No, you should still be able to be on video. I think it's coming through now. There we go.
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, so now I'm going to do from the beginning.
And you can still be on video. It might be helpful if you still are.
Can people still see the screen? Okay.
Yes.
Great. All right. I uncharacteristically made a few notes, so I will take myself off video so people think I just speak so fluidly without a note. I guess I really, to echo Kathy and Michelle's words, I'm very aware of the number of people who have registered for this webinar and another one that I was a part of at ISPCAN. And I'm pretty confident in two things: that our community is brimming with professional people who care very deeply about putting in place supports to address the impact of the pandemic on children and their families served by the child welfare system, and that really the response to webinars like this is a need for our community to come together to hear about innovative practices and ones that can be potentially adapted for the context that we're in. So some of the ideas that we're thinking in Ontario might not be a great fit, but there may be a kernel of something that is helpful for the context, for the populations we're trying to serve. And I'm really hoping that during the discussion, I'm able to learn from the expertise that's represented in this webinar. So just sort of maybe turn to this slide. The literature scan that the Kemp Center asked me to present was really an initiative that was done by the Fraser Mustard Policy Bench at the University of Toronto, and it's a policy mechanism that is co-led by myself and Dr. Stephen Miller, who's head of neurology at the Hospital for Sick Children. And years ago, we thought that what was missing in the policy landscape was an ability to provide literature synthesis and reviews that were done in a transdisciplinary fashion in response to short, medium, and longer term development needs of government. And so together we had this idea for a policy bench. The faculty that advises the policy bench really represents that diversity. There are our colleagues from Sick Children's Hospital, Catherine Birkin, Abby Denberg, and of course Stephen, and we have Jennifer Jenkins from the Department of Applied Psychology and Human Development. My great friend and colleague Marla Sokolowski is at the Department of Cell and Systems Development at the University of Toronto. Suzanne Stewart is director of the Walker Beast Bryce Center for Indigenous Health. So you can see that we really wanted to put together a mechanism that would respond to government needs around literature for their policy around child development. The whole idea really works because of the principal researcher, Marina Sistaveras, who was able to quickly master vast literatures, providing clear frameworks in response to specific policy requests. So the literature scan was done in approximately 4 days, and it really was in response to the ministry here in Ontario saying, is there any relevant literature that would help inform our response to the pandemic and the provision of child welfare services? And so that's, that's what these slides represent. So I'm very conscious that within the intervening almost month, there has been a number of very good research articles and resources developed for child welfare services that aren't reflected in this review, so keep that in mind. I'll just quickly talk about the methodology so you can situate it within the larger literature. One of the things we wanted to do, particularly in mid-March, was to present the literature with a clear understanding about what a pandemic was and wasn't, because there were lots of terms that were being used interchangeably by the media, and we wanted to make sure that we were very careful about the terms that we used. We really like the socio-ecological approach to child protection during pandemics. That was done for the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. So we really used it to frame this literature scan. We liked a document done by UNICEF, which really outlined leading child protection risks during pandemics. It took a global perspective. We felt that was important. There was an article by Kelly and Hansel that was done, which delineated, I think, emerging concerns from the United States perspective, and we drew on it heavily, and in particular, we used it to think about the Ontario child protection system. And then we have I think a very good kind of practical section around policy implications and how we can think about designing appropriate child protection strategies. I really like what Kathy said, and I've been repeating it a number of times for the past 4 weeks. I mean, nobody really knows how to go forward. It's just about bringing smart people who care about children together, and to constantly check in with one another and make sure that we're adapting, because the pandemic is emerging and the implications of it are emerging, and we want to make sure that our response for child protection systems reflect family and child needs. The documents are available. I think I can circulate these to my Kemp Center friends, but we post everything to do with child welfare research done in Canada on the Child Welfare Research portal, and we just today put a COVID-19 related research section. So both the full literature review or scan and the brief summary documents, both in French and English, are posted on ecwrp.ca. As I mentioned earlier, the literature scan was done in 4 days. I think only Dr. Sistaveras could do that in 4 days. And she used an iterative approach where she developed a list of keywords by looking through abstracts, government documents, subject headings, and phrases. And then throughout the search process, those terms were added, deleted, different terms were used to constantly improve the search strategy. She used peer-reviewed journals, although we didn't find many peer-reviewed articles that were helpful, I think, in mid-March. And she did a pretty good job, I think, at searching the gray literature for applicable resource material. The dynamics of a pandemic, I mean, I think these were probably more relevant when we were just beginning to understand the difference between an epidemic and a pandemic, but certainly it's of global proportion. It affects a great number of people. It's caused by a new virus strain, spreads very quickly from person to person. It causes much higher number of deaths than epidemics. And of course, we're all grappling with the social disruption, economic loss, and general hardship that it has caused. The origin of the COVID-19 pandemic was in Wuhan, China. It was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization on March 11th. There are flu-like symptoms, although part of our struggle is that the virus can present asymptomatically, but it's really characterized by a high rate of transmissibility and by the associated morbidity and mortality. I updated these numbers from the last time I did the webinar, which was 10 days ago, and I am saddened to say that the death number had increased threefold when I updated the number from 10 days ago. The socio-ecological impact of COVID-19, again, this was from the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. And what we really liked was that it used an ecological model, so person and environment. It was very intuitive for those of us who are social workers who were thought, I think, ecologically about individuals. And what we're using this diagram for is to kind of delineate the kinds of innovations that are happening at each of these levels, ecological levels. So child-specific responses, family-specific responses, community-specific responses, sort of the policy lens, and the impact of the disruption to social services and basic services, and to understand very clearly that COVID-19 does not equally impact all groups in society, that there are groups that are particularly vulnerable to its impact, and that there are unfortunately lots of examples of stigma against certain groups, given the kind of structural racism that we all work within. We also really liked the UNICEF document because we thought it was kind of give a very good global perspective on the impact of COVID. Certainly neglect may be the result of unprecedented economic hardship. Supervision issues presented with the closure of daycares and schools and the expectation from caregivers, employment about work that needs to happen outside and inside the home. It's clear that the mental and psychosocial distress that COVID-19 pandemic presents will impact everyone in the population and will have particular deleterious impacts on populations with pre-existing mental health challenges. The measures being taken to contain the spread of infection, social and physical isolation, and the resulting economic, social, and health impact will likely increase children's exposure to violence in the home and the likelihood that they will experience sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. And then, as I mentioned in the introduction, 2 weeks ago, the article by Kelly and Hansel was particularly helpful. They documented emerging concerns and helped to frame some of the more precise thinking that needed to happen pretty quickly. The concern about the increase in maltreatment cases, and I would say somewhat paradoxically, a decrease in reports to child welfare services. So one of the things that we've done in Ontario, we've recently completed an incident study and where it shows that 33% of referrals to child protection services are from schools. So we took out those data from the incident study for school referrals, and we put together a 2 to 3 page fact sheet about the nature of the school referrals, what was the primary concern for that child, how did the system respond, where was the family typically referred if there was an investigation as a result of a school referral. So people working within the Ontario Child Protection System could see, although they're experiencing a decrease in reports, that these were typically the concerns that they would have experienced had it not been for the pandemic, so they can begin to work with collateral and community partners to make sure that those children who would normally have eyes on them or come into contact with professionals would have, we could work together to identify those children's needs. Food insecurity and nutrition is already an issue for many of our families, and access is and is likely to be an issue that needs a systematic response. In Ontario, 1 out of 10 investigations involve a concern for substance use. There are a number of families who live in multi-generational households. There are a number of families where the caregiver has a dual responsibility, both to their children and to elderly parents. So how do you begin to contain infection, work within that somewhat complicated family structure? Access visits, I think that's something that we're grappling with in Ontario. Are there safe ways to facilitate the continuation of access visits? How do you deploy technology to ensure that children remain connected to their families? How do you plan for foster parents who become infected and are no longer able to provide care for children? And similarly, planning for youth who reside in residential settings has many considerations, including infection control, planning for infected youth and staff with alternate and available housing solutions. And then we really felt that there were sort of 4 main focuses that helped us frame some of the responses that are happening here in Ontario, Canada. And those were increased coordination and collaboration, the need for child-specific programming, the need specifically to address residential care issues, and the need really to strengthen child welfare systems before, during, and after pandemics. So this diagram really helped us to provide a framework to think about services who can support children served by the child protection. The education system, I about one example, that information to the hands of child protection. I think it's really educational losses children will experience, particularly those children who experience that loss during a typical summer break. For those children who are protected by their teacher, for those children who need vigilance and potential intervention during the pandemic, that there is a necessary connection with the education services that needs to happen, and that's something that a child protection system could facilitate. Hygiene instructions need to be interpreted based on the environment. One of the things we're working with around our workers is to understand the need for safe storage of toxic materials that we're being told to use in our homes to combat the COVID virus, but things like hand washing. So some reserves in Canada don't have safe drinking water. What's the instruction around hand washing if you're unable to access safe drinking water? The system directly needs to address economic hardships caused by the pandemic. We don't systematically screen for economic hardships. And as researchers, we've committed to making sure we are keeping track of the economic supports made available by our governments. So we've quickly culled all of the economic supports that are available to families, and we've circulated that document to child protection agencies, and we've pledged that we can make sure that we make sure we've updated the resources as they become available. So that's something very practical you can do, because we don't systematically screen for poverty, typically in child protection services. And then for health, we've developed a checklist, which I'll show you at the end of the presentation, where workers can systematically address infection control with their families and children based on the latest public health advice. So the child-specific programming, I think that the need to connect with families about how to develop a typical routine or a sustainable routine for children that is developmentally appropriate. I think we're all struggling with what that looks like, those of us that are parenting within four walls. John and I have been talking with colleagues in Italy, because we reckoned that they were essentially 3 months ahead of the COVID-19 than North America. And some of the things that they're stressing is the importance of maintaining some fun for a child in the day. So how can we as child protection workers work with families to get a moment of levity or a moment of fun in the day? We work with a foundation in Canada that's pledged to send a birthday box to every child who celebrates their birthdays during the pandemic. You can imagine that a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old look forward for 364 days a year for their birthday, and not being able to celebrate it in a typical way is probably devastating for that child. And in general, addressing loss, graduations, family get-togethers, all of those very important anchors that we all have are no longer able to happen. Are there virtual community gatherings that you can facilitate for the family? Residential care, certainly this is a specific concern, and I know it's the subject of a task force that has been struck in Ontario. Youth living in residential care have a high risk of infection, and there are specific considerations about the containment of that infection. The pandemic plan should address what to do if a staff is infected, if a youth is infected, what are the relocation plans, what are the needs for replacement. Those are really very precise and practical considerations when dealing with residential care and how the infection will impact care as usual. The importance of clear communication and sharing information is vital to the effective response. I think this is why I'm so pleased to be working with the Chem Center around these kinds of mechanisms that help to facilitate that. We really have been clear that even if you don't know the answer, that communicating you don't know the answer is important for caseworkers, for supervisors, for administrators, for governments, and to make sure that when people do innovate, that those feedback loops are active, and that information is constantly being circulated first from families and children. So it's important to involve children and families as part of the pandemic planning, and then making sure that the policy analysts and legislators that can help us at that sort of larger concentric level are informed about the experience of families and children, caseworkers, and administrators in child protection systems. It's critical to identify infrastructure that needs to happen to ensure that communication, but also platforms that can ensure that when clinical work needs to happen, that it's a secure and safe platform, that it's able to help the practitioner deliver the intervention as best they can, if it's not face-to-face. Then during the pandemic, there's certainly been an influx of resources to child protection systems, things like food hampers and devices that help keep families and kids connected. So one of the things we're talking about is how to be good managers of all those resources, who's managing the accountability for these goods, how do job responsibilities get assigned differently during the pandemic, because the work and the shift in the work really is of a vastly different nature. And then I guess I hope that we never have to go to the literature again looking for anything that will guide us during the pandemic. But if we do, I think it's very important that we all be good record keepers, that we critically reflect about what has emerged as best practices, and that we continually circulate those to the broader community. I talk to my team a lot about content validity, making sure that whatever product that we are thinking is a good idea, that we have those constant feedback loops from practitioners, from families, from children, and that when we look back critically to reflect how we did, that I'm hoping that we will say that we were able to provide some very good interventions for families and kids that made a difference, and really supported them through the pandemic. I guess the only other thing that I will say is before, I mean, people can see the concluding remarks, but the sort of 4 key words that have really struck me as integral to our response and helping the child welfare system respond to the pandemic COVID-19 in a very unprecedented situation is that it are information, respect, connection, and hope. So information, we are being inundated by information. How do we as researchers, as practitioners, make sure that we get the right information to the right person at the right time? That in all of those materials and all of those interactions across those concentric circles, that we demonstrate respect for children and youth and the situations that they're in, respect for caseworkers, respect for administrators, respect for governments that are really trying to respond to an unprecedented situation, connection, that the feeling of isolation can be so overwhelming that we want to make sure our families and kids remain connected to us in any way that we can facilitate, and that caseworkers feel connected, and that we really work as a community to respond to the pandemic. And I think hope, I mean, we have to believe that we will get through COVID-19, that our basic scientists will lead us through a vaccination and rapid testing, and that we will be able to respond to the need that the pandemic will leave for our families and children, given the unprecedented economic hardships that they will experience, we all will experience probably in 3 or 4 months from now in a very immediate way. And the presentation has all of the resources that we used and some other potential links that may be helpful, and anywhere where there is a number in the presentation, it's linked to the resource. So I'll send those along. And I'm just going to show you one more thing before I stop talking, because I think maybe I've talked too much, but nobody's going to tell me that, I guess. I have to go up here, sorry. Stop sharing. Okay. And can people see now what looks different? It's the cityscape of Toronto. Yes, okay. I'm
Yes,
looking
we
at
can see.
Kat. She can see me. So I'm gonna put my video back on, maybe. I put my video back on. So as Kathy said, nobody really knows what to do. So we start with, okay, nobody really knows what to do, but in the conversations that we've had as researchers with practitioners and administrators and ministry folks, this is one of the things that we'll begin to pilot with workers tomorrow. We have, at the University of Toronto, we have 5 agencies who have agreed to pilot this approach. And that is a checklist approach, and we're calling it child welfare engagement with families during a pandemic. And the idea is this, that workers can log into the site, which we've created in 2 weeks, not we, but we've worked with very talented people to create this site. And the idea is that every interaction with a family and a child starts with an in-home health checklist and a general mental health checklist. And so if I click on the in-home checklist, you can see that we're trying to be very clear that it should only be between 5 and 10 items, and that it should cover the most important constructs. So the in-home health checklist looks at economic hardships and material needs, infection-related concerns, and sort of planning around childcare and supervision issues. Now, our programmer is busily working away, so that's why we can't, but essentially if you click this resource D, it will come up with a resource that a group of us are working to make sure that this is the latest response for, does the family have enough food, medication, and supplies for 1 week? So resource D is an application for emergency economic, an emergency economic program, or potentially a food hamper that could be delivered and facilitated by the agency. So you can see that we move through, is there money for utilities and housing? Is anyone experiencing health issues? Does the family understand important social distancing? What about internet and device connectivity? And then is the family Indigenous? So that's a particular important question for those of us working in Canada. And the resources are linked here within the items and then at the bottom. And essentially I can just confirm that it's me, and then I can save the checklist, and that will allow me to print the page. I can email it to the family, or I can go back in and append it to their file, so that when I have my next conversation with them, I understand if there's been a change in the circumstance. And I'll just quickly, the similar concept to the general mental health, and then we're building them out along the service continuum. The ones that we're remaining to do are intimate partner violence, addictions. We have a supervisor checklist, and I think there's an infant checklist as well. So we're trying to keep it to 10. We think that's a manageable number. And we're working again across sectors to make sure that the content validity is always what it should be to serve families and children. Okay, Kathy, I probably talked too much. So now I'm going to stop talking.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a great deal of useful and helpful information that probably sparked some questions, or I see some already noted in the chat off to the side here. So just want to open it up for questions for Barbara or anyone else related to anything that was presented, or maybe just something that wasn't presented that got sparked for you.
Here's a quick low-hanging fruit question. Will we be making a copy of the presentation available?
But, well, yes, I'm sorry. And that's probably my fault. I should have sent it to the Chem Center prior to presenting, but I will absolutely, I'll do that as soon as I'm finished.
Great, thanks, Barbara.
Barbara. And for those of you that turned your camera off, if you want to come back on camera, we greatly appreciate it, so we can see you and connect with you at least visually.
Oh.
What else?
And then,
I'm wondering if anybody has any ideas to help clients who are being targeted based on their race because of the crisis. I'm working with someone right now that is being harassed and threatened because they think that because of the color of her skin, she has COVID. Doing stuff like telling her to go home, leaving nasty presents on the doorstep, you know, stuff like that. And that concerns me on top of the isolation, on top of what's going on, and trying to advocate for her, and I have no idea what to do just to help her, to help minimize that garbage.
Thank you for that question, Kathy. That is a pretty important question.
Yeah.
What have others experienced, thought of, maybe even done as it relates to that?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'll leave it to more practice people to answer what to do specifically with this client. But I think that the need for public health to address that upstream would be very, very important. To do a public health campaign about that has nothing to do with anyone's race, about whether you get COVID, and that. I mean, I mean, there's a lot of misinformation, and part of these checklists were to make sure that the information contained within them had the latest infection advice or instruction, and maybe we could build something that upstream about making sure as a public awareness that you start with that. The COVID-19 has nothing to do with any race, ethnicity, or religion. It has to do with a viral infection. I don't know if people have specific kind of clinical advice for Kathy around how to address it with this woman who's experiencing this level of harassment.
Hi, Kathy. This is Mary Lee. Hello, Barbara. I live in Brantford, Ontario.
So, hi, Mary Lee. Hi.
Just down the way. So this probably is fear-based on the part of people who are expressing these things, and that's very understandable in this time. To me, it sounds like a neighborhood response needs to happen. And is there a community-based organization that could have a conversation virtually with their neighborhood about what they're feeling, what their fears are? How do we treat one another during this time? Things like that.
I don't know. It's a public housing arrangement, so
Yep.
I'll look and see if there's somebody like that who could provide that service to the neighborhood.
Yeah,
Kathy,
just
one
have a
thing-
conversation together.
Mhm.
I can't imagine what it's like in the public housing settings where they have a postage stamp yard. They can't use playgrounds.
Right.
They're terrified, stressed,
Mhm.
hungry.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's awful.
Crazy.
So is there a way to respond to that particular community
Yeah.
living in stressful conditions that I can't imagine, truthfully?
Yeah.
I think with the campaign, what Barbara was alluding to, and what you've also said, Marilee, about sort of the community response. If you think about, maybe look up debiasing strategies, because you could actually overlay COVID with anything else, that people
Yeah.
want to attach themselves to in terms of why they choose to discriminate or act in a prejudicial
Mhm.
way. And if those debiasing strategies can kind of be overlaid, it may not be related to COVID, but it has the same opportunity to be
Impact.
applied in terms of helping people to get informed and recognize that you can apply one belief system across the board with a group.
Mhm.
So that would be one of the things that I would recommend. If I have your email address, I can email you some things that I've used. But you can also look those things up in terms of just debiasing strategies that might be helpful for the family to use to educate others, or for the community to use to educate themselves.
Michelle, Kathy did just put a resource in the chat box too about stopping discrimination during COVID. Kathy, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that or just to point that out to folks that resource is available there.
Yeah, so this is, it's on the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment website. So I know that we have a lot of folks that are not from Colorado, but there's, I think, some good information here that is somewhat general, including some posters and some different things that folks might find valuable as well.
What other questions are coming up for folks? John, I'm sorry, you wanted to
Oh,
share?
that's quite all right. Barbara, I was just wondering if you would want to elaborate a little bit more about the checklist and sort of your thoughts about how it might be sort of tested and what the experience is with sort of its development. And if you think that sort of thing might be adaptable for those of us in the States. I know you've got a lot of Canadian specific resources. So.
Yeah, sure. So it was a Saturday afternoon, a group of us who talk about child welfare services 7 days a week, I guess, and wondering what specifically to do. I think at that point, recognizing how many materials were being developed and how overwhelming it was for practitioners to cull them and to understand what practice looked like during the pandemic. So I am a big fan of the book, The Checklist Manifesto. So I said, well, what if we develop a tool kind of based on that premise that it was sort of 5 to 10 items to guide workers to facilitate those conversations with families and children along the service continuum that would act as a decision-making aid or tool, and that would be connected to a resource. We're working with Delphine Pauline Vitignier and Dr. Tina Malti to embed a training webinar, because we're worried that those kinds of conversations that, at least in Ontario, aren't so prescripted along decision-making tools may be difficult ones to have. So we're working with a couple of psychologists to embed a webinar within those checklists so workers can see what they should think about when they're delivering the content or going through the items with the families and children. It was research-based in that we sort of developed them based on the most clinical pressing issues that we see for families. Those are around addictions, economic hardships, a lack of social supports, and intimate partner violence. So the clinically specific checklists are along those 4 issues. And we're calling it like poverty is the emergency because, as Michelle said, those structural biases and racism are there. And when you layer on top the pandemic COVID-19, the impact is exponential. The items are going to be tested tomorrow at those 5 agencies. The first 2 checklists, Tuesday, Wednesday, we're going to adapt them based on worker feedback, and then we're going to continue to roll those out, embedding more and more video links and training links within them. Along those 10 fact sheets, we have little subcommittees of the fact sheet people, as we're calling them, or the checklist people, as we're calling them, to make sure that the items reflect worker feedback and that the resources are as current and as helpful as we can have. So that's our idea. I have no idea whether it's going to work or not. We will, I guess we can report back to the group to see how workers respond Tuesday and Wednesday. And if I'm happy to share anything we've done, I'm super happy to share. You can imagine that you could adapt them based on the resource that is most applicable to your jurisdiction as well. So I don't know if people have specific questions around that or not.
Thank you, Barbara. So either questions regarding that or just identifying something that you feel like you're needing most at this time.
Michelle, there's a question in the chat about helping school professionals know how to stay tuned in as a supportive resource as they're having contact with children and families inside their homes during COVID.
Thank you, Casey.
There is a note that for Colorado, the Colorado Department of Education is putting together with the Colorado Department of Human Resources, some resources that should be available by or before the end of the week. And it sounds like the person was interested in opening to see if there's any ideas here in the space from anyone about how that's being addressed.
What are schools doing in your community to support educators and tangentially to support students?
So I'm not an educator, but I've been working with this task force with the Colorado Department of Human Services and the Department of Ed on putting together these resources in various schools, both within Colorado and outside of Colorado, and put together lists of questions and sort of checklists that educators are using to reach out to kids. Things like, what's the best thing about being quarantined with your family and what's not going so well, and so that they can sort of delve into those questions with kids and find out what's going on at home, and also things to look for. And with the younger kids, because they either can't use technology to communicate, or because their caregivers are around a lot, some of them are doing things like doing calisthenics with the real little kids, and saying like, show me your arm muscles or show me your leg muscles, so that they can look for bruises and marks where they would normally be seeing bruises and marks on kids, if without having to move clothing or anything like that, so that they can just kind of do a check-in. And they're also trying to educate people about educators about looking for things, indicators in the home. It's not, we're all showing up on these Zoom meetings not looking like what we'd look like on a normal work day. We're all a little bit messier. We're all a little bit more unkempt. So that's not necessarily something that you'd use as the basis for calling in a report. But for instance, here in Colorado, it takes a couple of weeks before a pile of dirty dishes becomes something that attracts bugs, because we don't have bugs here. But if you see bugs crawling around, that means that those dishes have been out for a long time. So that's something, that's an indication of, sort of a longer term problem. So it's those kinds of things. If you have a student who's been really, really engaged in school and suddenly they're not engaged, those kinds of signs. So using slightly different standards because of the situation that we're in. I have some of those resources. I'd be happy to send them to Kathy and you guys can post them on your shared website.
That's very useful information. Thank you, Diana.
Sure.
And if we're ready for another topic, there's a question in the chat concerning people isolated at home right now with perpetrators of violence. And I know that there doesn't seem like good answers to that, but maybe, Michelle, that can be open for conversation because it's come up now a couple of times.
Yeah, it could almost be its own session, right? I think both the how to adapt to this environment for schools. I love the idea of doing the calisthenics just to kind of see if you can actually observe anything. And then domestic violence or intimate partner violence. What have folks done around that particular issue as it relates to assessing for, observing for safety concerns with families? Kathy, as I look at your body language is kind of like McGirt. I'm saying McGirt. Sorry if I got your last name wrong. But your body language is kind of like, yeah, it's almost overwhelming, have no answers to it.
Yeah. I'm wondering if any of the DV shelters are open or did they stop taking new clients because of the COVID crisis. Fortunately, I haven't had anybody recently that's needed that, but.
Go ahead, Andy.
So there was, the reason why I put it into the mix, because I knew that it would come up. And again, as we move forward with the other discussions here later in the week, there was sort of a proactive earned media piece on Channel 9 in Colorado this morning around one place. Safe House Denver was an example of calls for help are down. And I think as a reminder, the calls for help from mandatory reporters about abuse and neglect are down, mirroring the calls for help from adult victims. So I think just being aware of it is going to be positive, but earned media around this discussion is also important. I don't know if there's an easy answer with how do you assess a victim of an adult violence in the home when child welfare is involved, assessing something else, just to always remember that it's still on that list. Suggestions about how to adapt in this time, I think, are really what people would like to hear, whether that's you do it virtually or you don't, or you send a private message to the person you're worried about to connect with you later privately. I don't really think there's an easy answer to it, unfortunately. I know pediatricians in the primary care setting will also want to know that they still have to do this and can still struggle to do it. I'm going to mute.
That brings a question up for me, just, when you mentioned pediatricians and telehealth, this might be a whole nother session, Kathy. It's just thinking about how to assess for those kinds of things in this virtual environment. How do you communicate with the child? How do you assess physical, physical manifestations of abuse with a child in a telehealth environment?
Yeah, one of the things that's been interesting to me is that, especially as it comes to child abuse pediatrics, you can imagine that doing evaluations or assessments to telehealth prior to COVID-19 was something that really had limited application, and I think probably still has a lot of limitations. And we're forced into a situation where we don't always have a lot of options. And I know for caseworkers also doing visits or our families doing visits. And I've heard, just in a medical sense, it's really interesting how much you actually can do virtually. in terms of having a conversation, in terms of even doing things like getting a heart rate, being able to do a vital sign by having someone take their pulse and tap every time they feel the thump against their finger, which is interesting. I never thought of that. And it's just an example of, I think, with some creativity, there's a lot of things you can do. And what I've heard, back to the teacher question, because again, this is how do we assess someone virtually without being intrusive or disrespectful or creating, I heard on last week, where we focus will magnify. So where's that balance between not looking for something and seeing something because you're looking for it? But just a lot of teachers were talking about playing games with their kids. So just having an experience where they could just sort of play a virtual game, or, and these are things that also parents could do in visits, reading books, reading stories, but setting a stage for a little bit more of a natural interaction, so that you're not sort of creating something that feels very unnatural. And so I would think that in assessing for violence, whether it's child violence, domestic violence, if there's a way to create a more natural interaction, that might also reduce some of the, let someone's guard down a little bit to have a little bit more natural kind of assessment. The other thing that was interesting, and I'm actually going to put in the chat box a New York Times article that was just published about how we are so worried so much about distancing. I'm wondering if anyone is having any conversations in your community about, and I heard this from a friend of mine, that she and their very close friends, the neighboring family, have made a decision that their family extends beyond the four walls of their house. So they have made an intentional decision to sort of share with this other family, knowing that there is some inherent risk, but knowing that the ability to sort of care for their kids is incumbent upon needing some help. And I'm wondering if others are having conversation. I know in child welfare use, we spend so much time creating what that safety plan is, and it's often people that maybe can't be a part of a safety plan. So is anybody else having that kind of conversation, and what is that looking like? And I'll throw up this article in the chat box just out of curiosity for if you guys want to read it.
I think the issue about triaging who needs face-to-face services from a child protection worker is a difficult one. I think if we're just reserving face-to-face visits for a child that has a potential injury that needs to be investigated, we're missing the well-being part of our mandate. By being connected to families and understanding where they are in their coping, potentially a face-to-face visit can help to mitigate the deleterious impact of COVID in time to prevent an injury. And we're working with agencies to not just reserve face-to-face visits for suspected injuries. I think now may be a time in any jurisdiction in Canada, we are meant to do two things: protect children and promote their well-being. And I think that the well-being piece in this pandemic is something that we really have to emphasize. Partly the instruction to schools should be around making sure that you have measures in place to document the potential scholastic losses that a child could experience, and how you're going to mitigate against those and measure them and make sure there's a plan in place for that child.
I think we're all really curious about what do you feel like is needed now? If you in particular don't feel like there's a need. So there's been a mention around school, supporting teachers and supporting students, educators and students, domestic violence, conversation around just how we assess as a community, as professionals and as a community, how we're assessing for the well-being of children, to include the physical and the emotional. What else is there? What information are you receiving or seeking to help you through these moments?
Hey, Michelle, I wonder if I can help grab onto your question and give it a little spin with some stuff coming through the chat. It sounds like there's some worry amongst the child welfare community about really just conducting child welfare services online. How I engage with a family, how I understand the family's story, how I get them telling their story, how I connect virtually for the sake of assessing and mitigating their risks and safety needs. And I'm imagining a lot of people on this call have had some experience with those things in the last couple of weeks. If anybody has things to add and wants to dialogue with each other about what you've tried and how you know it's working, you know, child welfare workers feel a strong urge to want to be good at the work that they do. And it sounds like I'm getting the essence from this chat that there's some worry. How do I know that I'm seeing what needs to be seen when I'm only able to enter the home online?
I think that is a predominant worry for many child protection workers. Would you all agree with that? Or who would maybe that's a better question, is who would disagree with that? That that's something you're not worried about at all?
And or what are you telling yourself, or what creative strategies are you trying?
Right.
What's keeping you fueled during this time? How are you staying on mission?
I think one thing that us intake workers are doing when doing home visits is kind of being a little bit more flexible with our families. You know, on nice days, we're meeting outside, you know, in the front yard. Obviously, if we have to go into the home, we take law enforcement with us, especially because we're a smaller county. We're taking law enforcement out with us, and they have gloves. They're able to kind of hand that out. And then, you know, seeing if people don't really want to let us in the home, we're seeing them through screen doors. I mean, we're really taking precautionary measures. We have, for visitations, we're having them come in, wash their hands before they go in our visitation rooms, having them clean, disinfect everything. So it's kind of like taking all these precautionary measures and trying to be creative while still trying to keep children safe.
Thank you, Austin. Any other ideas people have used?
I don't know if this like helps as much as it may just be adding an extra layer of question to it, but I know there's been some things, and I know all the states are different. I'm coming in from North Carolina, so I don't want to put anything on other states, but one thing here that's a part of our, I'm in the foster care department, so part of our monthly contact is having basically an individual moment with the child. So there's a moment where you invite the foster parent to not be, you know, so that you can talk directly with the child in a private setting as much as you can. And so there's been a lot of like, now that it's virtual, there's not an easy way to make sure that it's an actual private time. And so that's been kind of a concern. And I know some coworkers that I've had have just kind of kept like reiterating, okay, we really need to talk to them privately. Like, can they, you know, go in their room? Can they shut the door so that we're FaceTiming them, or, you know, team meeting with them privately? And I do think that in some ways that does help with feeling like you can identify certain things, because they're not, you know, you're already having to do something that they're not used to, as in meeting virtually. So now, you know, now that if they can be by themselves, they have that opportunity to share something that maybe they wouldn't share if the person was there. And I think we just kind of had to acknowledge, like, okay, just because we're the only one, they're the only person I can see on the phone, doesn't mean that they're in the room by themselves. So there were some concerns where like we thought that we were talking to them by themselves, but there was a foster parent close by, and not that they mean anything by it, but I think they're just, you know, curious of to what the kids are going to say. So just that has been helpful, just kind of reiterating like, okay, can you go be in a more private place, things like that. But I mean, it's very overwhelming. It's a new thing for us, and it's a new thing for them. So I think part of it too for me is just acknowledging like where my power is, and a lot of the stuff that's happening right now is just out of our control. And, you know, we can do our best to make sure we don't miss things, but, you know, at the end of the day, we can only do what we can do until this is over, and then we jump in and do what we always do. So thank you all.
Well said, Monica. Very well said. Recognizing where your power is. And knowing that you all want to do the work. You want to do the hard work of seeking to protect and care for the children and the families that need it. But there are limitations. There are limitations in our former world. There are even greater limitations right now. So we are about 3 minutes before the end of our scheduled time together. I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you for joining us again today. All of this feeds and fuels greater opportunities for us to come together and get more drill down into some of the topics that will really be relevant as we all move forward in our new environment. So just again, want to thank you. We're going to be posting a feedback evaluation in the chat box. If you could take a few minutes before you log off to fill that out. I think there's just about 5 to 7 questions, I believe. If you could fill that out, we would love to hear your feedback. And much of the discussion that came up today, I think it's going to inform where we go moving forward. Kathy, any final thoughts or comments?
Well, I just want to thank everyone for taking time out of your crazy schedules and how uncertain in terms of things coming up last minute, I'm sure, to sign up for this and spend some time with us and share this time where we've learned from you, and hopefully you've learned a little bit from the group that's been convened. Thank you, Michelle and Casey behind the scenes for facilitating. Thank you, John, for the introduction, and Barbara, thank you so much for being here and sharing the great work you're doing to our north. I think for me, and I think probably for several others, it spurred some ideas on how we can incorporate some of the work you're doing and potentially creatively work together. Andy wrote in there, I love that power partnered with passion is unstoppable. I think it was a great comment to end on in terms of what Monica shared. If we take anything away is maybe just a sense of connectedness, that we are in this together and we don't really have all the answers, and regardless of what our role is, what our title is, that this is how we're going to get through this as a village. And we're thrilled that you took a little time to spend with us. We'll, as Michelle said, you will be hearing more from us. We'll be sending a little thank you with a link to the evaluation. If you didn't get it off of the chat box, please take a few minutes just to let us know what's on your mind. And then you'll be hearing more about cafes. That'll be more thematic, little deeper dive into some of these areas that you're telling us that you want to hear more about. So thank you. Be well. Take good care of yourselves, your families, and each other. It's an honor to be able to do this work alongside of all of you. And we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.
Thank you all.
Thank you.